Today I'll explain the entire Dying Light timeline in chronological order. This will include all 3 main games, a DLC, and even a prequel novel. Throughout the video there will be a timeline animation at the bottom of the screen, which should make it easier to follow along. So without any further ado, let's start with some backstory. Now I'm gonna say it right out the gate. The Dying Light franchise's premise is more or less like most zombie stories that preceded it. It's cut from the same cloth, which goes along the lines of massive virus outbreak that turns people into flesh-eating undead monsters is unleashed in the city. However, that set aside, what makes Dying Light stand out for me at least is its world building, as it's refreshing to see a story like this take place in a Middle Eastern themed setting. Another interesting thing about the Dying Light franchise is that they use the modern zombie formula. This means that here, you won't find zombies that hobble around like a bunch of old people who just took boatloads of Ambien. Instead, the zombies are super fast and overly aggressive at times. To give you a bit more idea of how the infected operate, you should know that the monsters in Dying Light are pretty much nocturnal. Sure, they can still eat your brains in the daytime, but they tend to be more sluggish and slower when the sun is out. Come nighttime though, the infected become faster, stronger, and just overall more lethal. With that said, there are 3 primary elements in the Dying Light lore that you should know before we dive into the full story of the games. First, there is Harran, the main setting of the first Dying Light game. It's a fully fleshed out place with a history dating back thousands of years. However, around 2014, Harran would become the epicenter of an epidemic aptly named the Harran virus. Now, having mentioned that, we go to the second main lore element in the Dying Light series, the Harran virus. To put it simply, the Harran virus is the same contagion that turned the city's citizens into rabid flesh-eating monsters. Nobody knows for sure where the Harran virus came from. There are only theories. On the one hand, there are parties who believe that it simply organically developed from Harran's food supply. But then there are those who think that the virus was a military experiment gone wrong. Some other factions think that the GRE, aka the Global Relief Effort, developed the Harran virus and released it in the city. And the final theory is that the virus came from actual aliens. Specifically, these people believe that an alien race called the Gadoids created and unleashed this biological weapon on Harran in hopes of sparking a global pandemic, which would in turn soften up the world's defenses and make it easier for them to conquer it. And so we come to the third main thing you should know about the Dying Light series, which happens to be the organization we just mentioned earlier, the GRE. As we said, the GRE stands for Global Relief Effort, and it's practically a fictionalized version of the World Health Organization. As Dying Light's lore goes, the GRE is an international humanitarian organization that specializes in containing and combating viral outbreaks. It was founded in 2002, and without giving too much away just yet, it plays a central role in Dying Light's saga. The Fall of Harran, 2014. Unlike most other zombie-themed franchises out there, Dying Light's initial outbreak didn't happen in one big city-ending blast. In fact, Harran's descent into its very own post-apocalypse happened relatively gradually. We could pinpoint the events that led to this in the year 2014. At the time, the Harran virus had already been going around the city. However, authorities' unfamiliarity with the virus allowed a pandemic to happen within Harran's ancient walls. In the beginning, Harran's own health department thought that the Harran virus was just this evolved version of the common flu. As such, they simply enacted typical protocols to combat the gradually spreading sickness. You know, washing your hands, wearing a mask in public, and social distancing. As you'd expect, all these warnings and public advisories did not amount to much. More and more people got infected by the Harran virus with each passing day, and you can forget about a cure, because none of the available medicine during this period did anything to prevent more infections from happening, much less curing the ones who already had it. Unsurprisingly, this led to stricter laws within Harran, and soon the entire city was put on lockdown. This lockdown was pretty much the same as the one we experienced back in 2020. Commercial establishments were closed indefinitely, school was out for what seemed like forever, and even health services like hospitals straight up refused to admit any more patients for fear that the Harran virus would just spread more quickly. As a matter of fact, even Harran's own health department decided to cancel its own virus prevention initiatives to relocate its resources to finding a definitive cure against the epidemic. Keep in mind that while all this was happening, more and more citizens were becoming infected with the virus. While aware that their own efforts in finding a cure wouldn't bear fruit, Harran's health department called for a consortium of medical experts to find an effective way to combat the virus. One such party that was invited was, of course, the GRE, given that they're an organization that specializes in combating biological outbreaks all over the world. In the meantime, Harran's city council repurposed the local sports event venue, Harran Stadium, into a field hospital that admitted individuals who were infected by the virus. In fact, it was here that the GRE planned on testing out the cure they were crafting, although it was still not finished at the time. On the other hand, those who were lucky enough to still be uninfected by the virus remained stuck at home. But the people of Harran soon experienced yet another shakeup when the GRE and their local government decided to relocate Harran's uninfected citizens to designated safe zones far from the city center. Speaking of these safe zones, we also get more hints about how bad things were going for Harran when we find out that its inhabitants eventually formed private militias with the supposed goal of quote-unquote keeping the peace within their respective domains. Not long after, Old Town pretty much became cordoned off the rest of the city. So much so that this district was barricaded by concrete walls to prevent anyone from going in and going out of Old Town. At this point, only authorized personnel such as Harran virus patients and medical professionals were allowed access to the place. The Old Town district wasn't an isolated case either. Remember Harran Stadium? Yeah, it pretty much suffered the same fate as Old Town, as it was also sealed off from the rest of the city to serve as a strict quarantine zone for people infected by the virus. GRE then deemed it necessary to establish a laboratory inside both Old Town and the Harran Stadium Field Hospital. These facilities, of course, were established to further research and ultimately craft a cure for the virus. These labs did yield favorable results, as the GRE's initial tests with their newly developed vaccine showed promising data. So the next phase was to do human trials. To do this, the GRE collaborated with Harran's Ministry of Defense in order to acquire test subjects for their cure. In exchange for their cooperation, the test subjects were to receive both medical treatment for the virus and a financial reward. It almost seems like things were looking up for Harran, right? Well, don't hold your breath. What happened immediately after this was the government of Harran pretty much giving their power to the GRE, and even more concerning, the city-state's military arm. In other words, all the freedom the people of Harran had was taken away from them. It was either you followed the military and the GRE's directives, or got put in a body bag, infected or not. So naturally, the first order of business was to suppress any potential threats to this new world order. Make no mistake though, they didn't arrive guns ablazing. Instead, they went with the all too realistic route of propaganda. They pretty much took control of Harran's local media outlets and used them for public broadcasts of their directives. As they put it, their main goal was to maintain peace and order through this trying time. And although that sounds harmless enough, there are several fatal consequences should Harran citizens fail to abide by the rules the GRE and the military had set. For one, any and all civilians are forbidden from even being in close proximity to their operations, such as the transport of the city's infected from one location to another. On top of that, there was a curfew in place. Then we get to the true meat of the matter. In an unsurprising turn of events, the military established a law where uninfected citizens of Harran who were caught sheltering infected individuals were, well, shot on sight. No due process, no trials, just an execution to save on precious government resources. Now, all this sounds too dire, right? Well, it is. And guess what? Things are about to get worse. You see, the military's press release stated that each and every person infected by the Harran virus was to be taken to their designated quarantine zones and subsequently treated. Understandably, the people of Harran thought this was a reasonable enough move in order to eventually put an end to the pandemic. While the military had another plan in mind. That's because the moment news outlets packed up and left the area, the military started mowing down each and every Harran virus patient they could find. To put it simply, the military's solution to end the epidemic was to take out each and every carrier of the virus. I mean, you can't have a medical crisis without patients, right? The military's hold on the city just got tighter from then on. Soon after their arrival, they decided to literally wall off Harran from the rest of the world. Now, Harran's civilians weren't complete idiots. They'd been duped once when the military made their empty promises of coordinating with the GRE to cure Harran virus patients, and they sure as hell weren't to get duped twice. So, as you'd expect, civil unrest brewed and erupted within the walled city. As these things go, of course, the military retaliated by cordoning off specific parts of the city they deemed too unruly for their quote-unquote benevolent regime. But there was a silver lining throughout all this, because in the midst of the chaos that had engulfed Harran, at least the GRE was able to successfully craft a viable cure for the virus, a drug known as antizin. Now, antizin isn't necessarily an end-all be-all cure for the Harran virus. Instead, it only suppressed the symptoms that stemmed from it. Still, it was a huge step forward for Harran at the time. Then again, for an organization advertising itself as the expert in crisis control and combating epidemics, the GRE had a pretty stupid plan when it came to distributing its supposed cure. Instead of going house to house and inoculating Harran citizens, the GRE made it so that you'd have to travel to their designated facilities to get a dose of antizin. So that meant you had to get your butt out of the house and risk contracting the virus if you wanted to get the vaccine. Absolutely a genius move. In any case, the GRE's directive that made people go out of their houses just caused even more chaos within Harran's walls. That's because people raced to these respective facilities, which ultimately allowed the virus to spread. On top of that, the citizens went understandably rabid for a dose of antizin. So given the relatively limited supply of the drug, of course people were willing to put hands on one another to get their shot. Those who had the wits to just escape this doomed city didn't fare any better either, as people who managed to get past the city's walls were mowed down with heavy MGs as well. Finally, the GRE decided to do something smart in regard to antizin's distribution. No, they still didn't go house to house to inoculate Harran citizens, given that the city had developed into a fascist war zone by the time the GRE wised up. Instead, they came up with an alternate distribution process. Airdropping crates of antizin throughout the city. That would surely stop people from rioting, right? Spoiler alert, it didn't. On a side note, this was also the same period where one of the very first canonical stories in the Dying Light universe takes place. I'm talking about the prequel novel titled Dying Light: Nightmare Row. Now, although Nightmare Row's characters and plot don't necessarily play a big role in the games, it successfully paints a picture of what Harran looked like prior to the beginning of the first Dying Light game. In this novel, the main character is a girl named Mel Wyatt. Mel was basically an Olympian competing in the so-called Global Games, which took place in Harran back before the city became an absolute mess. Oh, and if you're wondering what sport she was in, it was parkour. Yeah, classic Dying Light. Anyway, eventually Mel found herself trapped within Harran when cases of the viral infection surged throughout the city. All in all, Nightmare Row is a rather sad story, which saw Mel eventually getting infected by the Harran virus. Ultimately, her goal was to look for some of those air-dropped antizin doses. And if that wasn't bad enough, she also had to search for Paul, her younger brother, who got caught in the riots while visiting the city to watch Mel parkour in the Global Games. Mel doesn't make an appearance in the games though, because she was infected by the Harran virus and all that. Still, her story is a part of the Dying Light's history, and it's a pretty interesting one. Now that we've gone through the whole story of Harran's current state by the beginning of the games, it's time to talk about the events that happened within these titles. And where better to begin than the first game in the series, simply called Dying Light. Dying Light 2015. And so we arrive at the events of the first Dying Light game, which occurs in the year 2015. In this story, the main character is a guy named Kyle Crane. Now, not a lot is known about Kyle's past. What we can deduce is that 1. He's a Chicago native, 2. The guy was on his high school's track team, and 3. Kyle served in the USAF, aka United States Armed Forces, prior to the beginning of the story. In the present, Kyle is a mercenary who was hired by the GRE to conduct missions within the war and virus-ravaged city of Harran. At the start of the game, the GRE tasks Kyle with locating a man named Kadir Suleiman. Now, Kadir happens to be a former colonel in Harran's military, but has since defected and become a wanted individual after he stole sensitive information from the GRE. So Kyle accepts this mission, and he soon finds himself getting parachuted right in the middle of Harran. His quest immediately takes a detour when he encounters Tahir, Suleiman's lackey, and a couple of thugs working for him. A fight ensues, and Kyle is forced to shoot one of Tahir's goons. Of course, the gunshot ends up reverberating around the immediate vicinity, which then alerts a bunch of infected toward Kyle's location. Kyle is eventually rescued from becoming zombie food by a couple of insurgents named Jade and Amir. However, one of the infected manages to take a bite out of Kyle before he and his new companions can make their escape. Still, Kyle, Jade, and Amir soon find themselves at a bike shop named Mikla's Bikes. On a darker note, Amir ends up losing his life when he opts to hold off the infected who are after them, allowing both Jade and Kyle to escape. Eventually, the two reach a place called The Tower, which happens to be the home base of one of the many private militias inside Harran. To be specific, the tower serves as the base of operations of the runners. Now, runners are people who survive in Harran by parkouring and free-running their way to scavenge for supplies and avoid detection by the zombies, bandits, and the military. As such, you can say that runners prefer a non-confrontational approach to survival within Harran's walls. On top of that, they're also relatively reasonable as they prefer to use the tower as a haven for people who have been infected by the virus, but have not completely turned just yet. Because remember, even the military has a shoot-on-sight directive in place, while bandits prefer to shoot anyone, infected or not, for their supplies. Kyle takes some much-needed rest at the tower. Shortly after that, he meets Rahim, Jade's younger brother and a lieutenant within the runners' ranks. Rahim then tests Kyle to see if he'd be a good fit for their faction. So he orders Kyle to find one of the tower's residents, Mark. Mark is currently on the 13th floor of the tower, visiting his infected brother. Long story short, Kyle aces this test and rescues Mark from getting chowed down when his brother ultimately turns into a zombie after succumbing to the virus. From there, Kyle is welcomed to the runners. He then meets a man named Dr. Zerda Zir, who jabs him with a dose of Antizin to help with his recovery. Not long after that, Kyle goes on his first mission as part of the runners to acquire an airdropped Antizin supply from one of the GRE's airdrops. Coordinating with other people from the tower, such as Spike and Harris Brecken, Kyle does his tasks admirably. But the mission ultimately fails when Harris' team is ambushed by a group of rabid zombies. Harris is able to survive and recuperate at the tower. Still, their problem remains. They need more Antizin. Otherwise, the infected people they've been sheltering would eventually transform into man-eating beasts. With Harris unable to get back on the field, Kyle proposes to take his plan and retrieve a supply of Antizin from another drop. Now, keep in mind that Kyle's original mission comes from the GRE, and it's about locating Kadir Suleiman. Make no mistake, Kyle has not forgotten his duties. In fact, he reports his recent experiences, such as discovering the tower and meeting Harris, to his employers after setting out for his mission. Kyle's search for the airdropped Antizin supply leads him to Harran's slums. There, he finds out that a couple of crates landed in the vicinity, but one of them has already been acquired by members of Rice Gang. Just to clarify, Rice Gang is the name of Kadir Suleiman's own militia within Harran. Unlike the runners, these guys are absolute meatheads who have no problem taking out anyone in their way. Simply put, they're a bunch of angry, violent dudes with weapons. More importantly, both the GRE and Kyle don't know that Rice and Kadir are one and the same just yet, but they do have their suspicions. On the bright side, Kyle manages to locate the second stash of Antizin that landed in the slums. However, under the GRE's command, Kyle is forced to destroy the Antizin supply so that he would have an alibi to meet with the leader of Rice Gang, Kadir. Well, this whole scheme blows up in Kyle's face because he ends up running back to the tower when a group of zombies go after him. So not only did he not get a meeting with this Rice fella, but he had to come back to the tower with no Antizin to show for it. Upon returning to the tower, Kyle manages to convince the runners to have a meeting with Rice in order to broker a deal for a cut of their Antizin supply. Simply put, it's hitting two birds with one stone. Kyle gets to investigate Rice's true identity while helping the people of the tower. The Runners Council agrees to this and lets Kyle volunteer for the mission. The meeting is set, and Kyle manages to ID Rice to be none other than his original target, Kadir. On the other hand, Kadir sends Kyle to Karim, who happens to be the quartermaster of Rice Gang. Karim then tells Kyle he can get some Antizin from them if he helps them with an errand to restore the gang's radio signals all over the city. Kyle does this and goes back to Kadir, but the gang leader screws him over. Instead of handing over some Antizin, Kadir tells Kyle to do one more job if he wants to get paid: to collect tributes from the surrounding areas on behalf of Rice Gang. Kyle goes on a series of fetch quests to accomplish this. He then goes back to Rice Gang's base of operations and receives a call from Harris, who tells him that the 18th floor of the tower is at risk of being overrun with zombies. Kyle lets him know that Rice has promised him 2 crates of Antizin and that he'll get back to the tower as soon as he gets them. But you can always trust a villain to F you over, as Kadir once again refuses to honor his end of the deal and instead lowballs Kyle by handing him 5 measly vials of Antizin instead of the agreed 2 crates. Kyle takes issue with this, of course. In reply, Kadir tells him to give Jade to his gang so that they can turn her into a gladiator at their fighting pits. Kyle refuses, and this whole meeting ends with Kadir kicking our boy to the curb. Kyle returns to the tower and hands Jade the Antizin he got from Kadir. He then reports what happened at Rice hideout to Harris. To make matters worse, Harris informs Kyle that the GRE's broadcasts telling the residents of Harran where they'll do their next Antizin airdrop have suddenly stopped. Harris is understandably furious with this turn of events and elects to storm their rival gang's hideout to give Kadir a piece of his mind. However, Kyle manages to calm him down and promises he'd continue helping the tower. So Kyle decides to head to the rooftop and give the GRE a call. There, he meets Rahim, who's had a little too much to drink. Rahim almost falls from the tower's balcony, but Kyle manages to save him. Kyle then contacts the GRE and receives a call from Jade soon after that. Jade invites Kyle to go on a risky mission to steal the antizin they need from Rice Gang. Kyle agrees and they soon find themselves sneaking into a school controlled by Rice Gang. There, Kyle and Jade manage to retrieve a box that they believe contains a stash of antizin. However, they open it only to find that it contains dynamite. Still, little victories and all that. So the two decide to take the dynamite with them, hoping they can use it to blow up the zombie nest at the nearby demolition zone. Afterwards, Kyle has a meeting with Zara. He asks the doctor what the deal is with a specific kind of infected called the bolters. You see, ever since Kyle arrived in Harran, he's noticed that bolters have been watching him, almost as if these creatures were stalking Kyle. Zara tells Kyle that he's going to need tissue from one of the bolters in order to give him more information. So Kyle packs up and goes on a night mission where he manages to take out a bolter and grab a tissue sample from it. He then presents it to Zara, who runs diagnostics on the sample and gives him information about this particular infected sub-branch. Even better, Zara informs Kyle that he can possibly come up with a cure for the Harran virus, thanks to the bolter sample he brought. The problem is, Zara's lab is insufficient in crafting this miracle drug. Instead, he instructs Kyle to visit a guy named Dr. Camden at Harran's Old Town District, since he has the necessary equipment to formulate the cure. And with that, Zara collects all the data so that Kyle can hand it to Camden. Before Kyle can proceed, however, he gets another call. This time it's Rahim, who we discover has gone rogue and decided to blow up the zombie nest using the dynamite Kyle and Jade found. Rahim's gung-ho mission went awry, and he now asks Kyle to bail him out of this sticky situation. Kyle rushes to the demolition zone only to find the lifeless body of Rahim's partner, Omar. Soon after, he also finds Rahim still alive. Kyle then takes the dynamite from Rahim and proceeds to destroy the nest. But here comes some bad news. After returning to the spot where he first found Rahim, Kyle discovers that his friend was bitten by one of the creatures even before Kyle got there. Rahim then turns into a zombified monster and Kyle is forced to take him out. Kyle then reports back to the tower and tells Harris what happened to Rahim. Jade overhears this and is absolutely grief-stricken. But there's no time to mourn, as Kyle soon finds out that Rice Gang has attacked Zara's lab. Kyle immediately rushes to Zara's location, but he's too late. Kadir and his men have kidnapped the poor doctor, so Kyle decides to head straight for the gang's hideout to rescue the man. At the hideout, Kyle decides to give his GRE employees a call, but a representative from the Ministry of Defense answers instead. According to them, the Ministry of Defense has deemed all of Harran to be a Code 1 target zone. In other words, they're going to bomb the entire city until it's dust. Kyle isn't too happy about this and informs the ministry that Zara is close to formulating a definitive cure for the Harran virus. In reply, the ministry gives Kyle a couple more days before they proceed to blow up the entire city. Kyle soon finds Zara held hostage deep inside the gang's hideout. He tells Kyle that he handed all the data they've gathered for the cure to Jade. However, Kadir catches them before the two could make their escape. Kyle gets knocked out while Kadir stabs the doctor in the leg to make sure he can't leave. Shortly after, Kyle wakes up to find himself participating in Rice fighting pit game. Kadir sends wave after wave of the infected toward Kyle, but our guy manages to fend them all off. Kadir then reveals to Kyle the truth about the GRE, the same one he found in the files he stole from the organization. As it turns out, the GRE had no plans for finding a cure for the Harran virus. Instead, the GRE goal all along was to turn the virus into a biological weapon. Things heat up from here as Kadir orders his men to eliminate Kyle. However, Kyle goes full action hero mode as he picks up a machete and hacks away at his assailants before chopping off one of Kadir's hands. Kyle then tries to rescue Zara, but it's too late when one of Kadir's men stabs the poor doctor to death. With no other option left, Kyle escapes. But remember, Kyle was bitten by an infected when he first got to Harran. And with no antizin to help him suppress the virus, the symptoms finally catch up with Kyle as he passes out before reaching the tower. After some time, Kyle regains consciousness and finds himself at Ferry Harbor with Harris. Harris has some very concerning news. The GRE has completely stopped doing their antizin airdrops. However, Kyle is determined to help Harran find a cure for the virus, so he decides to track down Jade. Harris informs him that Jade has gone to a place called Sector 0 with the help of the Saviors, another faction within the city that specializes in smuggling people. So Kyle links up with this faction, who then directs him to a route leading to Sector 0. However, before Kyle can reach his destination, the Saviors inform him that Kadir has prepared an ambush for Kyle. As it turns out, the Saviors were forced to screw Kyle over after Rice Gang threatened them. Ultimately, Kyle is forced to fight off more of Kadir's men and make his way to Sector 0, aka Old Town. At Old Town, Kyle meets Troy, Michael, and Savvy, members of another faction called the Embers. Eventually, Kyle successfully gives Jade a call with the help of Troy. He urges her to steer clear of Camden's lab since it's swarmed with ravenous zombies. But Jade is too grief-stricken to listen to him, even when Kyle tells her about what the GRE and the Ministry of Defense are truly up to. Still, Kyle remains focused on his efforts to reach Jade. Troy tells him that Jade might be at the nearby university, so Kyle heads there. Again, he's too late. Kyle instead meets a guy named Fiden, who hands him a photo of a mirror that Jade told Fiden to give to Kyle. This photo has a message telling Kyle, "Not again," in reference to how she blames him for the deaths of her loved ones. Kyle then receives a call from Troy telling him that they've received word that the Ministry of Defense is now making preparations to bomb all of Harran. To make sure everything goes smoothly for them, the Ministry even sent out fake news telling the world that they have successfully relocated the citizens of Harran prior to their planned carpet bombing of the city. In response, Troy tells Kyle that she and her faction are planning on blowing up a few buildings on purpose to show media outlets that there are still uninfected people in Harran. After all, the zombies have no ability to perform this feat, given that they're basically mindless flesh-eating monsters. Kyle joins in on this and gets some explosives from Michael before planting them in one of the buildings. It almost works, but jet fighters from the Ministry of Defense manage to launch missiles at the buildings before Kyle can set off the explosives he placed. As a result, Troy and the Embers' plan to prove there are still survivors in Harran fails. A bit of silver lining though. Jade gives Kyle a call and asks him to meet with her. Kyle does as he's told, only to find out that Kadir has kidnapped Jade and is currently holding her hostage at Harran's museum. Kyle follows suit, and after a bit of impromptu scuba diving, our guy comes face to face with Kadir once more. In response, Kadir goes full-on Bond villain and sends thugs to deal with Kyle. Kyle deals with all the goons, which then prompts Kadir to send a bunch of zombies to take him and Jade out. Kyle and Jade work together to defeat the zombies, but Kadir reveals that Jade was bitten by one of them hours before Kyle even reached the museum. He then hands Kyle a single antizin vial, forcing him to choose between saving himself or Jade. Kyle insists Jade take the serum, but Jade refuses. They then move to a different room where Kyle suddenly passes out and has a fever dream. He suddenly wakes up when he feels Jade jabbing him with the antizin. Kadir sees this and sends out more of his men to deal with the two. Jade fights off more goons until she completely becomes a zombie, which prompts Kyle to end her suffering. But Kadir's not done yet. This time he sends out his main lackey, Tahir, to take out Kyle. A fight ensues and Kyle manages to subdue Tahir before checking Jade's bag to retrieve Zeta's data. However, all Kyle finds inside the bag are the tissue samples from the bolter he took out earlier. Kyle then forces Tahir to spill the beans about where they hid Zeta's files. Tahir acts all tough and refuses to sing, so Kyle just opens the scumbag's throat. Shortly after, Kyle reunites with Troy, who tells him about their new plan to prove to the world that the Ministry hasn't evacuated Harran. This involves broadcasting a signal using an amplifier hooked to the city's highest antenna. Kyle takes on this mission, and despite a few hang-ups along the way, he succeeds in sending out the broadcast. Just in time too, because the Ministry was just about to turn Harran into dust with their bombers when the broadcast went live. In the end, the Ministry of Defense is forced to cancel their bombing order. On the other hand, the GRE gives Kyle a call and tells him they'll help him get out of Harran in exchange for Zeta's files. Knowing that the GRE plans on using Zeta's research to turn the Harran virus into a biological weapon, Kyle refuses his employer's offer. Instead, he decides to bring the tissue samples to Dr. Camden's lab back in Old Town. Camden runs diagnostics on the samples and tells Kyle that they can still use them to formulate a cure. The problem is, Camden needed Zeta's files to proceed. Kyle, on the other hand, decides to check in with the GRE to see if there's any way he could cut a different deal with them. However, this plan doesn't come to fruition as Kadir contacts Kyle and tells him he has Zeta's files. What's more is that Kadir has brokered an agreement between himself and the GRE, Zeta's files in exchange for getting him out of the city. However, being the villain that he is, Kadir couldn't just leave the city. No. He first has to taunt Kyle, telling him to try and stop him if he can. So our action hero accepts the challenge and rushes to the gang's base. There he discovers that Kadir has betrayed his own gang when he took out several of his men. Kyle meets Kadir's former enforcer, Karim, who is almost at death's door. Karim decides to help Kyle by telling him how to reach Kadir, and our guy eventually reaches the main villain of this story. As you'd expect, a high-octane duel between Kyle and Kadir ensues. The grueling bout ends with Kadir falling off the rooftop, as Kyle ultimately manages to retrieve the files. In the aftermath, the GRE gives Kyle another call to persuade him to give them the research. Again, Kyle refuses and decides to stay in Harran, taking the files to Camden's lab. Dying Light, The Following, 2015. The first Dying Light game isn't the last time we get to see Kyle Crane, because now we move on to the game's DLC, called Dying Light, The Following. This one is set several weeks after the events of the base game. The Following opens with Kyle meeting with Lena, Harris' ex-girlfriend and the same doctor who helped Kyle when he first got to the tower. Lena then leads Kyle to a man named Jasir, a patient she had recently treated. Kyle finds out that Jasir possesses a map that shows a way to escape Harran. On top of that, he also mentions that there exists a group of people immune to the Harran virus. So he goes on a quest to find out more about what Jasir told him, which he thinks can be found on Jasir's farm located in the countryside. Now, the countryside is on the outskirts of Harran, and ever since the virus outbreak, it pretty much became a cesspool for those pesky zombies. Even worse is that Kyle discovers that his radio can barely reach his friends at the tower from this area. Regardless, Kyle eventually makes it to Jasir's farm, where he finds out that it's populated by a faction calling itself the Children of the Sun. Now, the Children of the Sun has existed long before the Harran virus outbreak, and, well, they're a religious cult led by a mysterious figure known as the Mother. Kyle discovers that members of this group are wary of any outsiders, so much so that the only people willing to engage with him at the farm are Khan, a merchant, and Jasir's daughter, Ezgi. Ezgi informs Kyle that he has to gain the Children of the Sun's trust in order to get any information from them. So from there, Kyle manages to warm himself up to the group by performing various missions for them. Eventually, Kyle manages to gain the cult's trust and meets the Mother and her priests, a group called the Faceless. Our guy is then taken to the Eye of the Sun, the cult's sacred temple, where he undergoes a ritual. This ritual involves Kyle getting exposed to a mysterious blue gas. And it's here we find out what Jasir meant when he mentioned people becoming immune to the Harran virus. However, this is not at all what he thought it would be. That's because this blue gas allows people who become exposed to it to become sort of invisible to the zombies. That is to say, it's able to mask Kyle's presence from the monsters, as he learns when he notices that a few infected, called biters, don't register his presence. Shortly after, Kyle encounters the same compound spilling from a downed military vehicle in the middle of a field. He then receives a call from the Faceless, which eventually has Kyle track down the source of the compound, a convoy meant to transport quote-unquote supplies to a certain cave. Now, this cave is in an ominous place, as a few of the Faceless have been reported missing after entering it. Soon enough, Kyle finds out that the missing priests were either killed or kidnapped by what remains of Rice's gang. So Kyle decides to track down these sleazebags and rescue the Faceless guy they kidnapped, a priest named Brother Omen. Kyle manages to locate Omen, but he soon succumbs to the wounds he got from Rice's gang. However, it's not all bad, as Omen is able to tell Kyle where he can find the origin point of the blue gas, and how Rice's remaining gang members managed to arrive at the Harran countryside, the local lighthouse. Kyle doesn't waste time getting to the lighthouse, where he finds Khan. As it turns out, Khan was the one who brought Rice's remaining thugs to the countryside, and now they're planning on assassinating the Mother. Khan goes full psycho too, as we soon discover that he ordered Rice's thugs to blow up the lighthouse while he and Kyle are still in it. The explosion ends up taking out Khan, while Kyle survives like the action hero he is. Kyle then makes his way to the Children of the Sun's hideout to intercept Rice's thugs. However, when he gets there, he's surprised to see that all the other Faceless have been eliminated. The only one still alive is the Mother. From there, the Mother presents Kyle and us, the audience, with a big revelation. It turns out that the Mother used to be the wife of a colonel working for the Ministry of Defense. She eventually became the Children of the Sun's leader, and before her husband died, he showed her what she basically refers to as humanity's last hope against the Harran virus, the blue gas. But all that pales in comparison to what Kyle finds out next. The Mother is actually infected. However, unlike your typical zombie, the Mother managed to retain her wits. This is all thanks to the blue gas, which is revealed to be a compound that was developed to help transform anyone infected by the Harran virus into, well, let's just say a smart zombie. This allows zombies to retain a degree of their consciousness after exposing themselves to the compound. You see, the blue gas, when inhaled, allows you to retain your humanity in the daytime. However, when night falls, you become like all the other zombies out there, rabid, flesh-eating creatures. On the other hand, we also learn that this blue gas also comes in a drinkable liquid form that's much more potent. The Mother then invites Kyle to help her fulfill her ultimate purpose, to end the Harran virus once and for all. by detonating a nuclear warhead hidden inside the Children of the Sun's base. And it's at this point that Dying Light's canon gets pretty much thrown out the window. So much so that even the game's developers, Techland, refuse to acknowledge which is canon and which is not. You see, Dying Light, the following, has a couple of endings. In one of them, Kyle agrees to the mother's proposal and they both end up nuking all of Harran. Of course, this takes out everyone, and I mean everyone, even Kyle himself. Then there's the second ending. Here, Kyle refuses to detonate the nuclear warhead and instead opts to steal the mother's remaining stash of the blue compound. Kyle drinks it, after which he and the mother get into a good old-fashioned scrap. Kyle immediately defeats the mother and escapes the cult's base to emerge on the outskirts of Harran itself. Remember, up to this point, the Harran virus has been contained within the city's walls. A group of kids spot Kyle and are absolutely terrified when they see him. Kyle then checks on himself, and just as the mother told him, he immediately realizes that he has turned into a sentient zombie. So yeah, neither of these endings is exactly a good one, and I'd be lying if I didn't tell you how much it sucks that the developers didn't even bother clarifying which ending is canon. But it is what it is. Don't get it twisted though, the Dying Light saga is far from over. More importantly, this isn't the last time that we get to see Kyle Crane, as he's also the main character in Dying Light's third main installment called Dying Light the Beast. But before we sink our teeth into that one, we first have to discuss the series' second main entry, Dying Light 2 2036. And so we arrive at Dying Light's next installment, simply titled Dying Light 2. Dying Light 2 has an entirely new main guy named Aiden Caldwell. It's also set a couple of decades after the events of the first game, in the year 2036. Most glaring of all, Dying Light 2 features sandbox-style gameplay, where players are given choices that affect certain parts of the story. And much like the endings of Dying Light the following, the developers don't consider any one story path to be canon or otherwise. Still, there's an overarching plot here. However, before I tell you all about Aiden's adventures, we first need to explain what exactly happened in the time between this and the previous game. First of all, we find out that by the time Dying Light 2's story kicks off, Harran and everyone in it have already been wiped out. When exactly it happened, much less how, remains to be seen. On top of that, we also discovered that the GRE managed to craft a proper cure for the Harran virus sometime after the end of the first Dying Light game, which effectively put an end to the epidemic. But not everything was peaches and cream at this point in time. True to their scummy word, the GRE continued messing with the Harran virus until they were able to successfully produce a biological weapon derived from it. It only took around half a decade after the events of the first Dying Light game before things blew up in the organization's face. That's because in 2021, the same biological weapon that the GRE created, a much more powerful strain of the Harran virus called the Tachy-Transmittive Harran virus, THV, leaked out of their lab. This then kickstarted a series of events that pretty much screwed up the whole world. The end of the world as we knew it culminated in an event called the Fall, in which the world's infrastructures and systems were overturned seemingly overnight. It goes without saying that the THV was far deadlier than the original Harran virus. So much so that both the GRE's cure for the OG Harran virus and their antizin medication couldn't do anything to help people infected with THV. The only known deterrent to this new improved virus was ultraviolet light. Now, Dying Light 2's story starts in 2036. During this era, we learn that humanity has been almost completely wiped out by THV, with the remaining survivors forming small communities and settlements on their own. One of these settlements is called Villador, located somewhere in Europe. It also happens to be one of the largest remaining human communities left. Much like Harran, Villador is a walled city, which proved to be effective in keeping its inhabitants safe when the THV first broke out. Now, Villador is a rather wild city with a trio of main factions vying for its control. First, there are the Peacekeepers, who are basically similar to the military complex. Then there are the Survivors, who are pretty much Dying Light 2's version of the Runners, meaning that they do parkour and stuff. And then there's the Renegades, aka the absolute scum of the earth. For the most part, Dying Light 2 centers around Aiden's quest to reunite with Mia, his sister. Now, Aiden is what you'd call a pilgrim, a person who travels across the remaining human settlements mainly as a messenger and courier. At the beginning of the story, Aiden is working as a pilgrim, which leads him to Villador. There, he meets another pilgrim named Spike, who gives him a lead that would hopefully direct him to Mia. According to Spike, Aiden has to meet with a guy named Dylan, who would then direct him to Vincent Waltz. Now, Aiden and Mia are all too familiar with Waltz. As soon as we find out that this was the same doctor who experimented on the siblings years ago, in hopes of developing a serum against THV. It was also during this period that Aiden and Mia got separated after a freak accident happened with Waltz's lab. In fact, even the GRE was not cool with Waltz, as the organization ultimately fired him after they learned of all the shady crap he'd been doing. So after getting this bit of information, Aiden proceeds to have a meeting with Dylan, but they're interrupted when they're attacked by a group of zombies. Aiden's day goes from bad to worse when one of the creatures sinks his teeth into him, effectively infecting him with THV. Regardless, Aiden and Dylan travel together, and our boy even manages to save his companions from a gang of renegades along the way. Waltz also catches wind of Aiden and Dylan, so he pursues the two. Eventually, Dylan gives Aiden a functional GRE pass, but not before telling him to keep Waltz's hands away from it at all costs. As Dylan puts it, giving Waltz the GRE pass would inevitably lead to Villador's downfall. From there, Dylan tells Aiden to bring the pass to a place known as the Fisheye, and when he gets there, he should link up with another contact named Lawan. The two go their separate ways, and Aiden witnesses Dylan's untimely demise when Waltz catches up to his friend right after that. Aiden's search for the Fisheye eventually leads him to a district within Villador called the Bazaar, which is presided over by the Survivors faction. Aiden gets into immediate trouble upon entering the Bazaar, considering that he doesn't have a biomarker on him. Just FYI, a biomarker is this device that allows people to keep an eye on the THV levels of a person. Luckily enough, a man named Harran bails Aiden from the Bazaar's authorities. To give you a bit of background, Harran used to belong to a faction called the Night Runners. Now, the Night Runners were basically superheroes in the world, as they focused on saving people. However, their faction just fizzled out of existence at some point. Back to our story. Harran tells Aiden that Villador has a civil war brewing within its walls. This all stems from the fact that a peacekeeper named Lucas was recently murdered, a crime that the peacekeepers themselves think was perpetrated by the survivors. Later, Harran manages to help Aiden get himself a biomarker. He even does our boy another solid when he helps Aiden reach the city's so-called central loop, which happens to be the same area where he could find the fisheye. Eventually, a riot breaks out between the survivors and the peacekeepers. More importantly, Aiden uncovers the truth behind Harran. As it turns out, Harran was the one who actually took out Lucas. Even worse is the fact that Harran did this under orders from none other than Waltz. In any case, Harran ends up taking a bullet that incapacitates him. But this isn't the last time we see this guy. As for Aiden, he eventually finds himself traversing a tunnel that belongs to the GRE. He then meets a peacekeeper named Aitor, but they're interrupted when Waltz arrives and attempts to get his hands on Aiden. Curiously, Aiden finds out that Waltz is jacked beyond natural human abilities, which allows the scummy doctor to steal his GRE pass. Waltz then proceeds to take out all the peacekeepers in the area, leaving only Aitor alive. Of course, Aiden's not going to quit, so he runs after Waltz and ultimately pings him at a rundown car manufacturing facility somewhere in the city. Waltz uses the GRE pass to turn on a console inside the building while he and Aiden confront each other. Their scuffle only stops when a mysterious lady arrives and manages to subdue Waltz and give Aiden enough time to retrieve his GRE pass. Aiden and the lady then escape the factory, and he soon learns that this woman happens to be the same person that Dylan told him to meet, Lawan. We find out that Lawan has been after Waltz this whole time due to the fact that she was also a victim of his experiments in the past, much like Aiden and his sister. On top of that, Lawan also tells Aiden that the reason Waltz had Lucas assassinated was because Lucas was the first guy who got hold of the GRE pass. Not long after, Aiden and Lawan make their way to Villador's center and find out that the console Waltz accessed back at the car factory effectively restored electricity to the area. Our boy then soon meets Jack Matt, the leader of the Peacekeeper faction, and Frank, the former head of the Night Runners. Frank and Jack then cut a deal with Aiden, where they'd assist him in finding a doctor working for the GRE so that our boy could eventually gain access to the organization's private files. This in turn would help him find his sister Mia. In exchange, Aiden has to go to the highest building in Villador in order to activate a radio antenna, which Frank and Jack would use to coordinate with the people of Villador and other surviving communities out there. Aiden accepts the deal and successfully reactivates the radio. In turn, he receives information about a legit GRE doctor named Veronica Ryan, who happens to live in the city's Bazaar district. Soon, Aiden finds Veronica being hunted by the renegades, so he helps her get rid of the thugs, and the two band together to go to a place called the Observatory. According to Veronica, the Observatory contains the GRE files Aiden has been looking for. Upon reaching the place, Aiden is disappointed to find out that the GRE's database doesn't have any information about Mia. However, he does discover that Waltz didn't just bring back electricity to Villador's central district when he activated the console at the car factory. As a side effect, Waltz's actions also activated a failsafe that the GRE placed within Villador, which comes in the form of a missile barrage that would level the entire settlement. And as if on cue, Waltz appears in front of Aiden and Veronica to try and start some smoke. As you'd expect, a scuffle ensues, and it ends badly. First, Aiden loses control of the THV coursing through his body. He then goes wild and brutally takes out Veronica in the process. To make matters worse, one of the missiles from the GRE's failsafe hits the observatory, which ultimately knocks out Aiden and allows Waltz to make his exit after stealing the GRE pass again. Not long after, Lawan arrives on the scene to retrieve Aiden. We soon learn that it's only a matter of time before Aiden fully transforms into a THV zombie, thanks mainly to the crappy experiments that Waltz did to him in the past. Eventually, Aiden comes face to face with the leader of the Renegades, a man named Chris Williams, who used to be a colonel within Villador's military. He tells Aiden that he was the one responsible for preventing the GRE's failsafe protocol from destroying Villador in the past. However, now that Waltz has reactivated it, it's up to Aiden to put a stop to this looming threat. So Chris tells him to go to a place called the X-13 Lab, aka Waltz's hideout. Aiden and Lawan soon travel to the X-13 facility and find out that it was originally designed to be a doomsday shelter for GRE's higher-ups. Along the way, the two get separated, and Aiden realizes that the X-13 lab is the same facility where Waltz experimented on him and Mia. Soon, Aiden comes face to face with Waltz again, but he also finally reunites with Mia, and this is where we get a big twist. Regardless of what you might think of it, it turns out Aiden has suppressed his memories this whole time. The truth is that Mia isn't his sister, she's actually Waltz's daughter, and she's been infected by a particularly potent substrain of THV. Now, Waltz has spent the past decade and a half trying to find a cure for Mia. This explains why he was so determined to grab the GRE pass from Aiden, since he wanted to use it to bring back power to the X-13 lab and allow him to continue coming up with a cure for his daughter. Simply put, the GRE's failsafe protocol that threatens to destroy all of Villador is just a necessary evil for Waltz to save Mia. After learning this, Aiden and Waltz get into one last scuffle. Waltz is taken out, but the GRE pass is destroyed in the process. In the aftermath, Lawan catches up to Aiden and tells him she's gonna plant bombs all around the missile stash in the facility in order to save Villador from getting leveled. And just like Dying Light, the following, we get a couple of endings based on what the player decides to do. Specifically, Aiden is presented with two options. On one hand, Aiden chooses to rescue Lawan and get out of the X-13 facility. In the ending, the GRE's missiles are launched and a huge chunk of Villador is destroyed, taking a significant number of its citizens with it. In the aftermath, Aiden leaves the rubble of Villador and continues living his life as a pilgrim. And if you made the right choices throughout the game, there's a chance Hakon joins Aiden in his journey outside of Villador. Then there's the second ending. In this one, Aiden chooses to rescue Mia. Lawan manages to plant the bombs around the GRE's missiles and blow them up along with the X-13 facility. Aiden and Mia escape the place before it's blown to pieces, but Mia succumbs to her condition not long after. When the dust settles, Aiden chooses to leave Villador and resume his job as a pilgrim. And again, if you manage to make the right decisions throughout the game, this ending might also include parts where we see Hakon rescuing Lawan just before the missiles wreck the X-13 lab. On top of that, Lawan might also accompany Aiden when he leaves Villador, depending on your choices. And that, guys, is the full story of Dying Light 2. As we've mentioned earlier, Dying Light's developers, Techland, have yet to clarify which ending or specific plot points are considered canon to the franchise. In any case, we do know that by 2036, a guy named Aiden Caldwell is roaming the wastelands of the world, all the while continuing his battle against the THV. Regardless, the Dying Light saga continues with its third main entry named Dying Light the Beast. Dying Light the Beast 2036. And so we arrive at the latest entry to the Dying Light series, which takes place at some point after Dying Light 2. This tale features the return of the series' OG protagonist, Kyle Crane. And boy, I'll say this, the man has had it rough in the time since we last saw him. That's because our story begins with Kyle trapped deep within a secret science facility. And although he remembers the details of everything that's happened with the world ever since the virus outbreak, our man has no idea how he ended up in this god-awful place. All Kyle knows is that he's been made to suffer through continuous torture and experiments inside this laboratory. And should he one day be free, he's going to take out the one responsible for putting him here in the first place. One day, the facility scientists conduct their routine procedures on Kyle, strapping him to a gurney before preparing to experiment on him. However, this day's different, as a couple of men clad in military garb sneak into Kyle's room and proceed to eliminate the shady employees before trying to help our guy from his restraints. The effort falls flat, however, when armed personnel burst into the room and subdue Kyle's rescuers. As this happens, Kyle blacks out. He wakes up later to see that the GRE scientists are about to perform their procedures again, but this time they're accompanied by the man who Kyle perceives as the one pulling the strings, an unknown figure in a fine suit wearing a gas mask. This man talks smack to our guy and basically tells Kyle there's no way he's going to escape this facility. On top of that, they've acquired a new test subject for their ungodly experiments, presumably one of his rescuers from earlier. Throughout all this, our hero can only swear vengeance upon the man in the suit. After doing his monologue, the stranger leaves and Kyle passes out again, only to witness that the other test subject in the room has broken free from his restraints. The creature proceeds to take out the researchers, while Kyle mysteriously gets freed from his restraints as well. However, soon enough, Kyle loses consciousness once more. When he comes to, our hero sees that the entire room has been thrashed. Kyle spots a radio and hears a woman named Olivia on the other end. Olivia helps Kyle find a way to get out of the facility, as our hero discovers that the entire building has become a bloody crime scene, littered with dead bodies and zombies. Along the way, Kyle's almost pinned down by a large group of zombies when he suddenly feels a strange rush come over him. With it comes the strength that you'd only normally see from full-blown volatiles, and Kyle uses this newfound power to single-handedly take out the zombies chasing him. Upon finding a way out of the facility, Olivia reveals that the stranger from earlier, the head of this facility and the man behind Kyle's abduction, is called the Baron, and he's made changes to Kyle's physiology. Kyle eventually finds himself away from the Baron's facility, where Olivia tells him that he's currently somewhere in the Alps. From there, Olivia tells Kyle to meet with her at a nearby monastery. Kyle goes there and comes face to face with Olivia, who we find out used to be a GRE employee who has since defected from the organization. Oh, and it's not that she's helping our guy out of the goodness of her heart. Olivia actually strikes a deal with Kyle. If he helps her get out of the region, she will assist him with the Baron. We also get introduced to a new substance called GSB, which Kyle needs to help him combat the side effects of the procedure that the Baron has done to him. Now, GSB is something that's extracted from other GRE test subjects' blood. You see, these test subjects are not your typical zombies. They're instead called chimeras, and they're much deadlier than your run-of-the-mill infected. Kyle soon takes down his first chimera, which allows Olivia to extract GSB from its body. Just in time, too, because Kyle was just about to lose control and turn into a raging monster. Fortunately, Olivia makes it in time to inject Kyle with the substance before things get worse. Kyle passes out again and wakes up a few days later inside Olivia's hideout. She explains that she's going to need GSB from here on out to make sure he doesn't lose control. On the bright side, each chimera possesses a different type of GSB, which grants Kyle varying perks as he jabs them up his veins. And as Olivia puts it, Kyle's going to need to collect all the GSB he can find in order to defeat the Baron. Additionally, Olivia gives Kyle more information about what the Baron did to him for 13 years. It turns out that our hero wasn't just a test subject. He was the test subject. Simply put, Kyle was the Baron's most prized possession. More alarming for Kyle, however, is when he finds out that he's now pretty much a half-human, half-zombie hybrid, thanks to the experiments. Apart from that, Olivia also sheds more light on who the Baron really is. The man's real name is Marius Fisher, and he's basically a Nepo baby from a big pharma company who plans to take over the world by creating an army of hybrids. This man usually holes up in the Fisher family estate, surrounded by his own paramilitary organization. Olivia and Kyle's meeting culminates with the two setting up a plan to ultimately get to the Baron. Olivia tasks herself with locating more GSB-rich chimeras for Kyle to take out and harvest, while Kyle is assigned with finding more allies who can help them in the fight against the villain. So after teaching Kyle how to extract GSB using one of her devices, Olivia and our hero set off to do their respective missions. Kyle soon meets a group of survivors somewhere in the city. Our hero helps them deal with a chimera. Kyle harvests its GSB, and he further assists the crew when one of its members, Jacob, asks him to locate their leader. a woman known as Florence. Kyle meets Florence shortly after that, and after a sad turn of events that sees one of Florence's soldiers take his own life after getting bitten by a volatile, Kyle decides to help Florence's group deal with another creature that's been bothering them. Along the way, we also discover that Antizin basically doesn't exist anymore. As Olivia puts it, between everything that happened during the Harran outbreak and the present, Antizin has just become too ineffective in dealing with this global crisis. Kyle soon sets out to hunt the creature and finds out that it's less a chimera than it is a new improved version of a volatile. That is to say, this one's smarter than your ordinary infected zombie. So Kyle is forced to retreat when he comes face to face with the creature. Afterwards, he puts a hold on the hunt and goes back to Olivia, who tells him about the location of a new chimera he can take down. This eventually leads him to a battle against a chimera known as Mist, which our guy defeats and from which he extracts more GSB. After that, Kyle heads back to Florence's group, who ask for his help in reactivating the nearby power plant. Kyle agrees, and this journey leads him to a guy named Largo, a technician working with Florence's group. The two men work together to get the facility online and running, but things take a violent turn when Largo reveals he's actually working for the Baron. What's worse is he's just called some of the Baron's men to ambush Kyle just as they finish fixing the tower. Kyle is first subdued, but ultimately dunks on the Baron's men when he hulks out and eliminates each and every one of them. Kyle then comes back to Florence and manages to convince her group to form a rebel alliance with him to eventually bring down the Baron. Afterwards, Kyle meets a guy named Eli who asks for his aid in locating his father, William. Like the stand-up guy that he is, Kyle agrees to this and eventually locates the old man. It's here we find out that much like in Harran all those years ago, the locals of this area were rounded up and supposedly quarantined in an effort to avoid the virus from spreading. The problem was that this just trapped the locals in an enclosed space, which just made it easier for them to turn into monsters when the virus eventually made its way to them. Anyways, Kyle fails to save William when the old man decides to take his own life with an explosive meant to stop the infected from escaping into the city. Kyle then goes back to Eli to inform him about everything that's happened. Shortly after, our hero meets with Florence again, who informs him about an area where the Baron is suspected of gathering more test subjects for his experiments. Kyle heads there where he comes into conflict with more of the Baron's hired guns. He soon locates a scientist working for the Baron who tells him that they've developed a compound to lure chimeras. Kyle manages to get all the information he needs about this from the scientist and soon proceeds to use the compound to lure the chimera himself. A fight ensues between our hero and a chimera known as the Behemoth. Of course, Kyle wins, and he gets to extract more of that sweet, sweet GSB. Our guy then meets up with Olivia again, who tells him she has discovered that the chimeras share a part of his DNA. But where Kyle tries to dig deeper into it, Olivia tells him she needs more time to look into the matter. So Kyle, in the meantime, goes back to Florence's group. He teams up with Florence, who leads him to the local mine. She then informs our hero that the Baron has just entered this mine with his men. Excited to get his revenge, Kyle goes into the mine only to discover that Florence has screwed him over. It turns out that she's made a deal with the Baron to hand Kyle over to him in exchange for her people's safety. Kyle and the Baron come face to face, and the dastardly villain informs our hero that he has a brand new test subject in this same mine, one that has proven to be an upgrade compared to Kyle, a creature known only as the Beast. But as if on cue, the same test subject manages to escape containment, while the Baron tries to cause a cave-in within the mine to finish off Kyle. Of course, our hero is able to survive the collapsing mine, and he heads back to Florence's hideout, but she's not there anymore, which means leadership of their group now falls on her right-hand man, Jacob. Kyle gets Jacob up to speed about Florence's treachery, which Jacob knew nothing about. In any case, Kyle continues to work with Jacob, who informs him about another group of survivors in the area that our guy could recruit in the fight against the Baron. What's more is that this particular group happens to be former test subjects who have been infected by the virus. Florence drove them out of the area in the past, and they've since set up shop in a different part of town. Kyle soon locates their hideout and meets a contact from the group named Sven. As is usual for our hero, Sven turns him into an errand boy, tasked with finding a couple of his friends who have gone missing. This leads Kyle to a warehouse where the Baron's men are in the process of abducting Sven's pals. Kyle goes full action hero and ultimately rescues them before handing them over to the group. Our guy is then led to their hideout, where he meets Lydia, the leader of these infected survivors. Lydia knows who Kyle is, especially the fact that the Baron wants his head. so she refuses to be involved with him in any capacity. On the other hand, Sven doesn't agree with Lydia's idea to just hole up in their hideout, since the guy knows that the Baron will come for them sooner or later. So Sven bypasses the hierarchy and he starts working directly with Kyle in an attempt to mount a resistance against the Baron. They begin by meeting with Selby, the group's radio technician. Selby instructs Kyle to attach a signal amplifier to the Baron's communication system so that they can spy on him. Even better, we find out that Lydia is willing to join Kyle's budding rebel alliance if he can do this. Kyle doesn't waste the opportunity, so he goes on this mission and soon succeeds, allowing Selby to listen in on the Baron. The first bit of info they got from the transmission is an alarming one though. That's because Selby and Sven catch wind that the Baron's men are planning to blow up the town hall, the same building in which Jacob's group lives. So Kyle rushes to the location and defuses the explosive before getting into contact with Olivia once more. As before, Olivia debriefs him about her latest findings regarding the chimeras and tells Kyle about one that he could take out right away, a chimera called Toxin. So our hero heads over to this chimera's location and they get into a death match. Kyle wins, and that means more GSB up in our boy's veins. He then hands over another sample of the chimera's DNA to Olivia before receiving a telepathic message from Sven and Lydia. They inform our guy that the Baron and his men are conducting experiments at the local school, but bandits are interrupting their operations. Kyle, Sven, and Lydia see that as an opportunity to further mess with the Baron and even hopefully add more members to their rebel alliance. There, Kyle meets one of the infected group scouts, Ray. Kyle and Ray work together to infiltrate the school. And although teaming up with the bandits is a no-go, Kyle does get an even better prize when he comes across one of his former scientists working with the Baron. This expert, Camilo, tells Kyle about the Baron's activities, where our hero can find more dirt about the guy. Kyle then helps extract Camilo out of the school and hands him over to Ray's so that he can be taken to Lydia's group for questioning. Kyle then checks out the archives and goes back to Lydia to inform her about the intel he was able to gather while there. However, their meeting is interrupted when they realize that Ray never made it back to the hideout with Camilo. So Kyle does the group a solid and searches for the two missing men. He eventually locates Camilo, who tells him that Ray died when they came across a huge monster on their way to the hideout. In any case, Camilo is given to Lydia's group, and we find out that he used to be the only slightly less evil scientist on the Baron's payroll. Camilo was actually the guy responsible for concocting a serum that helped the test subjects from fully transforming into mindless beasts. From there, Lydia fully commits to joining Kyle in his fight against the Baron. Kyle then meets with Olivia once again, and it's business as usual, with her telling him about the latest chimera and Kyle hunting it down. Kyle defeats this creature, which is called the Matriarch, and heads back to Olivia's hideout. There, Olivia tells Kyle that she's discovered the Baron is developing a biological weapon meant to incite rage in the infected so that they can use them as weapons against his enemies. On top of that, we find out that Olivia's dad is the scientist who developed this after the man was forced to work for the Baron. At this point, Kyle realizes that Olivia doesn't just want to get out of this place, she also wants to rescue her father. But to do that, they first have to deal with the Baron. Kyle swears he'll try his best to save Olivia's dad before heading back to Lydia's group. At the hideout, Camilo informs our hero that he's discovered a new development in the infected's abilities, namely that their telepathic powers can be developed to a point that one can take control of others' minds. However, Camilo needs to do more research, so he tasks Kyle to grab some DNA samples for him. Kyle agrees to this, and he even gets his hand on a chimera called Wraith along the way. Afterwards, our guy heads back to Lydia's base and hands over the samples. He then meets with Olivia again, who sheds more light on how exactly Kyle ended up at the hands of the Baron. As it turns out, Olivia's dad was the one responsible for bringing our hero to the Baron all those years ago. But make no mistake, Olivia's father didn't do it for the sole purpose of turning Kyle into a guinea pig. You see, Kyle had already been infected by the Harran virus prior to coming to the Baron, which effectively turned him into a half-human, half-zombie hybrid. Olivia's dad had hoped to come up with a cure for Kyle's condition using the Baron's resources. And to his credit, Olivia's dad was partly responsible for preventing Kyle from turning into a full-on infected. But the pharmaceutical Nepo kid eventually caught wind of Kyle's presence in his midst. So the Baron forced Olivia's dad to turn Kyle into a guinea pig. Not only that, but this whole ordeal culminated in the Baron and his scientists extracting Kyle's DNA, which then led to the creation of the chimeras. On top of that, Olivia informs Kyle that the Baron is also super interested in the infected's telepathic abilities, which led to him developing a biological weapon in order to control them. Kyle and Olivia then conclude that they should dig deeper into the Baron's endgame before proceeding with their usual business. Shortly after, Kyle returns to Lydia's group to discover that Camilo's research has now yielded some very promising results. Because now, Lydia claims she's able to use her telepathic abilities to control the infected. However, they still need a so-called drug called neurorays to finalize Camilo's research. So Kyle goes on another fetch quest, which leads him to the local psychiatric hospital. With Lydia's help, the infected are kept in check while Kyle infiltrates the facility to grab the neurorays. Things get dicey, but our hero ultimately succeeds in his task and hands it over to Lydia's group. As soon as his business is finished here though, Kyle receives a distress call from Jacob's group, telling him that the Baron's men are laying siege to their HQ at Town Hall. Kyle heads over there to deal with the problems, only to find out that a squad of powerful monsters is attacking the place. Still, Kyle manages to defeat them with a little help from Lydia's newfound monster-controlling abilities. Oh, and our hero also gets reunited with Florence in the aftermath. Of course, Kyle is absolutely furious when he sees the same person who betrayed him earlier. But cooler heads prevail and the two patch things up after Florence explains how the Baron gave her an ultimatum to give up Kyle or he'd take out each and every one of the survivors in her group. Lydia also arrives on the scene, and with all the pieces in place, the Rebel Alliance decides to take the fight directly to the Baron. To do this, they'd have to lure him out first. You see, the Baron has been trying to retrieve his valuable escape test subject, the so-called Beast, ever since it escaped the mines. So Kyle, Lydia, and Florence plan to use the Beast as a decoy to get their hands on the Baron. The Rebel Alliance makes the necessary preparations to capture the Beast, which sees Kyle coming face to face with this formidable monster. A confrontation between the two ensues, and Kyle manages to knock out the Beast. They then subdue it with the help of Lydia's telepathic powers and a dose of Kyle's own blood before taking the poor guy back to base. Not long after, Kyle meets with the rest of his rebel friends to check on the Beast. They wake him up and the creature has now reclaimed its mind thanks to Lydia and Kyle's help. Then there's the big twist of our story, as we find out that the Beast is none other than Aiden Caldwell, the main guy from Dying Light 2. Aiden tells the group that he and a mutual friend of theirs, Spike, originally came to this place in an attempt to rescue Kyle from the Baron. But things happened, and that didn't come to pass. What's worse is that Spike is nowhere to be found, with Aiden thinking that the Baron has him in his clutches. Aiden also gives more information about how it was the GRE who originally found Kyle in the aftermath of the Harran incident. They then handed him over to the Baron since his company was an affiliate of this shady organization. As Aiden puts it, the Baron has been operating independently ever since the GRE folded in the interviewing years. Aside from that, Aiden also clues in the group about how the Baron pretty much capitalized on his already tweaked DNA to turn him into the Beast. However, their meeting is interrupted when the Baron gives our heroes a call demanding that Kyle surrender himself. And in true villainous fashion, the Baron even kidnapped Olivia to make sure our guy complies. The Baron bullies his way through the conversation, demanding that Kyle show up to his designated spot tomorrow at noon. Aiden, on the other hand, wants to rush into things. You can't blame him though, especially after what the Baron has put him through. Still, Kyle manages to calm Aiden, and the whole group makes preparations to confront the evil billionaire. The next morning, Kyle wakes up to some bad news, that Aiden has slipped out of their base to deal with the Baron alone. Obviously, this didn't work out and Aiden got captured instead. The rest of the Rebel Alliance then decides to rescue Aiden and Olivia, and finally deal with the Baron by infiltrating his HQ. And by the way, his HQ is a literal castle. Yeah. As night falls, they proceed with this operation. Our heroes manage to storm the castle by morning, which leads to a direct shootout with the Baron's goons. Unfortunately, there are just too many of these hired guns, and the Rebel Alliance almost gets defeated. Sven even loses his life during the confrontation. On the other hand, Lydia realizes what she has to do to win this skirmish. So she uses her powers to control the nearby infected and sick them on the Baron's underlings. It works well in thinning down the enemy forces, but the Baron ups the ante and has his men use the red gas to bring more powerful monsters into the fray. Another confrontation erupts, but Lydia and Florence instruct our hero to focus on saving their allies and getting to the Baron while they deal with his forces. Kyle obeys the command and heads over to the castle's interior. Kyle soon manages to locate Aiden inside one of the Baron's operating rooms. However, another wrench is thrown into the mix when Olivia screws over our hero, which ends with Kyle being trapped in the same room as Aiden while knockout gas flows through the vents. Kyle was just about to pass out when he noticed Olivia taking a sample of his blood. Kyle comes to and finds himself strapped to a chair in front of a dinner table. Spike and the rest of the Rebel Alliance are there too, as we learn that they ultimately lost the battle at the castle's courtyard earlier. The Baron arrives with Olivia, and the dastardly villain goes on a long-winded monologue about how it was he who freed Kyle in the first place as part of his experiment. He also reveals that he's pretty much finished developing his biological weapon, which now allows him to control the infected. On top of that, the Baron starts to gloat about how he's able to use both Kyle and Aiden's DNA for his own purposes. The Baron eventually shuts his trap and proceeds with the main reason he's gathered our heroes at the dinner table: to kill them. He begins to summarily execute our heroes one by one, starting with Spike. He then turns to Camilo and succeeds in taking him out in spite of Lydia's efforts to stop him. More drama ensues when the Baron sets his attention on Lydia. Olivia tries to beg for him to stop, but the Baron chooses to test her loyalties instead. So he hands Olivia a gun and tells her to shoot Kyle. Olivia apologizes to our hero, revealing that she betrayed him because her dad had recently been bitten by an infected, and the Baron refused to help the poor guy unless Olivia delivered Kyle to him. However, suddenly, Olivia gets cheeky with the pistol and tries to shoot the Baron with it instead, only to find out that the magazine is empty. This proves where Olivia's true loyalties lie. So the Baron attempts to take her out too. Thankfully, Lydia comes up clutch and manages to use her powers to momentarily incapacitate the Baron. Olivia doesn't waste this opportunity, of course, and uses it to stick a fork right in the Baron's eye. She then proceeds to free our heroes, while the Baron gets juiced up with a dose of his serum before ordering his men to deal with their remaining hostages. The rest of the Rebel Alliance escapes, while Kyle and Aiden deal with the Baron's goons and chase the villain deeper into his castle. Our two protagonists soon catch up to the Baron on the castle's helipad, just as the villain's about to escape. But there's no running from this, as Kyle and Aiden shoot down the man's helicopter. This sparks an epic firefight between our heroes and the Baron. Along the way, Lydia gives them a telepathic call requesting backup, so Kyle sends Aiden over to her while he deals with the Baron himself. A one-on-one duel between Kyle and the Baron ensues after the dastardly villain juices himself up with more of his serum, effectively transforming himself into a chimera. Regardless, Kyle makes good on his promise by drop-kicking the Baron off the castle before impaling him with a piece of a broken ledge. And as they say, our heroes lived happily ever after. Well, not really. That's because as soon as Kyle defeats the Baron, we get one last revelation in our story, as a GRE helicopter arrives on the scene to pretty much tell Kyle that their organization is still around. Kyle's GRE contact starts talking smack and leaves, while our hero vows to get revenge against them next. Even better, Kyle doesn't have to go at it alone this time, as he's now accompanied by valuable allies like Aiden, Lydia, and the rest of their crew. And that, guys, is the full Dying Light timeline, at least so far. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you soon in the next one.